Yeah, it's based on three basic premises. First of all, supply chains map on to life cycle thinking, and life cycle analysis is central to how NGOs and others think of sustainability. So, one of the basic premises is sustainability thinking in consumer products and other industries map on the supply chains very well. A second one is that as supply chains have become more global, many of the sustainability problems have been driven to new extremes. So multiple jurisdictions and lack of transparency at and all the things that come with that have created additional problems that need to be looked at. And then finally, cross-sector partnerships. The partnerships between NGOs and corporations have gone from zero to very common in just a couple of decades, which is really kind of startling. That came from a historical background of conflict and antagonism to collaboration, such that I think NGOs have become parts of members of supply chains. And so what we tried to do in the paper was integrate supply chain thinking, cross-sector partnerships, and then social network theory to help bring some context to that.
Sure. So we believe that social capital has always been an important part of supply chain management. We know that when we look at buyer-supply relations, that the individual relations of the people involved in those organizations can positively or negatively influence the organization relationship. But when we look at these new emerging cross-sector supply chains that involve non-governmental organizations or NGOs, especially as they address environmental or social causes, we believe that social capital is all the more important because NGOs generally have limited access to financial and human capital, and therefore use social capital as a means by which to create value for their partners and their customers and society.
Well, just the background from a personal perspective, both Kevin and I have been very involved in cross-sector partnerships through the Sustainability Consortium, and we both also have a longstanding interest in social network theory. So, sort of a natural next step that we'd look at these things. The other authors in the paper, David Hyatt is a supply chain scholar as well, has worked on cross-sector partnerships for quite some time, and then Andrew Hutson, who is actually an employee of the Environmental Defense Fund, has a longstanding interest in these things as well. So we all came to these concepts really quite naturally. More theoretically, in the social network theory world, social capital, which is the central construct of the paper, has a long-standing history at the individual level. We've long known that individual social networks provide lots of different benefits to individuals, and those concepts more recently have been applied to interorganizational relationships, mostly in the for-profit realm, interorganizational alliances. But given the rise of cross-sector partnerships, it seemed like there was a pregnant opportunity, basically, to apply some of those concepts to this world, the cross-sector partnership world.
First off, I think that it's important to recognize the extent to which environmental groups and non-governmental organizations are active in supply chains. So we've, in practice, we know for maybe 20 to almost 30 years now, that there has been an increasing level of activity over that time. And I think so what we're doing here is, in the supply chain literature, is we're trying to tap into that and identify how these other actors are having an impact on chains and supply chain management. And
so our findings were first that cross-sector partnerships were becoming much more common in industry. Corporations are looking towards NGOs to both provide them the expertise to solve environmental problems, as well as tap into their own networks for both knowledge and expertise, as well as leverage and connections to action. So these partnerships are becoming more common, and our theoretical exploration found that social capital theory was the best explanation, the causal explanation of what we were seeing in practice in terms of how NGOs were succeeding in the space and what kind of made the difference between success and failure in achieving their mission.
Yeah, well, it's not really an empirical paper, so there's no conclusions or findings per se. But what we tried to do in the paper was elaborate on, well, first of all, integrate social network theory and social capital into what our experiences have been in cross-sector partnerships, and then elaborate on those to identify areas where, well, to identify what we think has been happening in this space. Identify maybe some reasons why it hasn't made more progress than they have. The cross-sector partnerships have a lot of potential, but they really haven't resulted in any significant changes to date. And then offer some suggestions for how they may be made more effective, and where supply chain scholars might go to next.
I think what we're doing here is to open possibilities for conversations about how NGOs are operating in supply chains, and then how we can use these concepts of social capital to understand those interactions. And so then I think what we're doing then in terms of our findings is basically we're saying that there's not a lot of research in this area, that is social capital, around cross-sector partnerships and supply chains. And that includes, that's not only in our literature where there's none, but out there in the broader academic world, this is a sort of a new approach, if you will. Obviously, social capital and those concepts have been around for quite a while, and also cross-sector partnerships as a practice have been around for quite some time. But now it's just a good opportunity to start thinking about, pairing these up and examining the phenomena of cross-sector partnerships and supply chains from a social capital perspective. That's our contribution, I think, and that's our finding. Of course, we go into some detail. There's several dimensions to social capital theory, and we settle on these three of receptivity, reach, and richness. So again, in terms of the doors that we're opening, there's lots of ways to sort of employ the differences in those and studying this phenomena. For instance, I think in the paper, in one area, we talk about how a strong social capital which is characterized by lots of trust and strong ties could actually inhibit progress. Actors become sort of too involved, for instance, with one another, and NGOs' roles are to bring about social and environmental change, right? They're about changing systems. So to the extent that their overall goals get compromised or relegated back to small incremental improvements, not that that's bad, but what are we giving up through this process of having strong ties and building lots of trust between the actors? Maybe. So the idea is maybe a scenario where there's not a lot of trust, but there's more tension might lead to more social or environmental change, to the extent to which that's the objective of the NGO actor, but maybe not so much other corporate actors the supply chain.
Okay, so a big focus of this paper is about how NGOs build and deploy their networks of relationships to meet their mission and objectives. As someone who has studied NGO supply chain engagements from an academic perspective, as well as someone who has been deeply engaged with them for over a decade as an NGO practitioner, this paper shines a light on how we can be more strategic and more effective in both building and deploying our social capital. As we point out in the paper, a lot of efforts to date have been based on incremental projects that focus on eco-efficiency, that create quick wins and are easy to communicate for the environment and the bottom line. What's interesting is the execution of these projects has produced a lot of trust and an accrual of social capital that can be deployed for the kinds of transformational change that we really need to face the myriad existential threats we face as a species, climate change being the most pressing. The future of collaborations, therefore, needs to be focused on driving change at the appropriate scale to deal with these challenges, which are really mostly about public goods. And as we know from basic economics, public goods problems can never be solved by companies or NGOs acting alone. We need collective action, most pressingly in the form of sound public policy, but also in the form of technological innovation. Partnerships between companies and NGOs based on really sound social capital are going to be where these come from. The challenges to date, many companies have been reluctant to engage in environmental policy in a constructive way, but that's changing. As we saw last year, as the Trump administration was considering pulling the United States out of the Paris Agreement, companies across the spectrum of industries, with the help and the leadership of NGOs, mobilized. We didn't win that fight, but an important precedent was set. This is really also about technological innovation, and we're now in the midst of what we're calling a fourth wave of environmentalism, driven by technology and innovation. Environmental progress doesn't just happen. It has to be propelled by successive waves of innovation, each unleashing a powerful new tool. The first was land conservation, the second was the fourth of law, the third was power of market-based solutions. Today, we're seeing the emergence of a fourth wave of environmental innovation, a revolution in protection and advocacy driven by cutting-edge technologies that give people the power to scale up solutions to our most urgent environmental challenges. The root of these solutions are going to be based, a lot of them, in collaborations between companies and NGOs, really finding where the solutions lie and really figuring out how to apply them for the biggest impact.
So I think social capital, first of all, we take the perspective of NGO managers. That's our perspective, but I do think that there's a lot of value for corporate managers as well. I think that all managers actually, especially in the supply chain context, think in network terms, but they haven't really they haven't had constructs to hang those onto. They haven't had concepts to hang their thinking onto. So I think the social capital perspective provides some language for them and a new way of thinking, or a lens for how to think about building relationships in a very strategic way. So ideally, reading the paper would give managers new perspectives on how they might more effectively build relationships with NGOs and NGOs with corporate managers.
Practitioners need to recognize that NGOs are a more common actor in the space that they need to operate in. It is not very conventional, for example, for business school students to learn about what NGOs are and the role that they play in the corporate world. And so I think that both academics who are researching these phenomena, as well as practitioners who have to engage in solving environmental problems within their supply chains, need to recognize that NGOs are somewhat different than corporations. They're driven by different missions. They have different values, but where they can provide value is through that social capital, not only with between their staff and your organization, but also because of the multitude of other connections that they have that can spur action.
From a practitioner perspective, I think I'd love to see more of these concepts made available to practitioners, to NGO managers and corporate managers as well. We spend a lot of time, I think the paper, the primary purpose of the paper was to motivate thinking and research among supply chain scholars. And from that perspective, I actually think social network theory and social capital have a lot to offer to supply chain scholars, irrespective of whether they're for-profit or nonprofit partnerships. I mean, it's taking off. It's beginning to take off in the supply chain world, but the network concepts have a lot to offer. So ideally, this paper will help advance that thinking as well. I like to joke with my supply chain scholar or colleagues that your middle name is a network concept, right? Supply chains or networks. The ultimate goal really is to spark thinking and theory building and research on these cross-sector partnerships, treating NGOs as members of supply chains, and exploring ways that the different concepts from social capital can be applied to answer really interesting and important questions.